Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Okay, so it's now my great privilege to welcome Professor Peter Clarke, who's from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. He's in the Department of Cell Biology and Morphology there. By pure coincidence, this was not planned at all, two consecutive Faraday speakers at the beginning of this term are both working on cell death. It's not no sort of hint to anybody here or worries in particular, but that is also, of course, what our speaker, Andrew Wiley, was speaking about 2 weeks ago. But Peter's been working on the whole area of neuronal cell death in the context of neuronal development and other things he might tell us about over these past years. But he's also done a lot of writing and thinking and speaking on this whole area of the brain, determinism, mechanisms of the brain, and so forth. And so we're delighted he's come to speak to us today on brain determinism and free will. So thank you very much, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have happy memories of this room from the Faraday Summer School in the summer, which I've been to several times, and it's been a very enjoyable event. But today I've got a very challenging topic, brain determinism and free will. And it's challenging because it involves so many complicated things, and this is really to confess some of my ignorance, because although I shall talk quite a lot about neurobiology and cell biology, it's the thick line here, I shall say a little bit about quantum physics, which I know less about, and a bit about philosophy. I think I had IS. So I'm a specialist in neuronal death, as Dennis said, and I'm only a very amateur philosopher. I'm very intimidated by the rigor of modern analytical philosophy, but we'll have to look at that. And then I shall say a little bit about theology as well. I'm a Christian. I'm interested in theology, but I'm not formally trained in theology. So the problem that we're facing is, if our brains work deterministically, then our behavior must be predetermined. How then can we be free? How can we be responsible for our choices if they were predetermined before we made them? How can we be responsible for our behavior if it was determined not by ourselves, but by the impersonal laws of physics and chemistry? And if someone does want to see, there is one there and there is one there. If you're courageous enough to come up to the front. Now, different kinds of determinism. Before I talk about determinism, I should at least clarify that there are different kinds of determinism. If you talk to a social scientist, he'll think about social determinism. I'm the slave of my social environment. Psychoanalytic determinism, I'm the slave of my unconscious. Genetic determinism, I'm the slave of my genes. And we all know that genetic determinism is not really true, not complete, because of the importance of the environment, because identical twins are not really identical. And in fact, I'm an identical twin, and my twin brother would be very unhappy if he thought that everyone thought I was absolutely identical to him. But what about the combination of genes plus environment determinism? Many people do believe that this is a complete determinism. If you look at many psychological papers, for example, on what causes IQ, is it genes, is it environment? No, it's a combination. And the implication is that the combination of genes plus environment, that really does determine IQ and many other things. And I shall argue, one of the main points I'm going to be making is that even the combination is not really deterministic. But then supposing we could take into account of every atom, every electron, this would be a more detailed study of the brain. But if we could study every single atom and electron in the brain, would this be complete determinism? And we call this physical, or sometimes Laplacian determinism, because of course Laplace was a great determinist talking about the universe, not the brain, but of course the brain is part of the universe. So is my brain a slave to the laws of physics? And my subject today is really I'm going to focus on these two kinds of determinism. Genes and environment determinism, which I shall argue is incomplete, and physical Laplacian determinism, which I shall argue may be almost complete. So to this question of determinism and free will, it's important to know that there are several kinds of answers, and the three most dominant are hard determinism, which says the past completely determines the future, including our own brains, so free will is an illusion. And not many philosophers really support that view. People have in the past, though. And then compatibilism, which is the most popular view among philosophers, says that determinism is compatible with free will, so there's not really a problem. That's sometimes called soft determinism. And then there's libertarianism, which says we do have free will, and this is incompatible with determinism. And so we've got a problem. We've got to somehow find a source of indeterminacy in the brain. There is one seat here in the corner, right in the front row, if someone's courageous. And so if we look at this, if you believe that free will is true, and most people think it is true in at least some sense, and determinism is true too, then we've got compatibilism. If you think determinism is false, we've got libertarianism. And then if you think that free will is false, then we've got hard determinism or hard indeterminism. But I shall focus on these two positions. And coming to this subject as a non-philosopher, I've had to try to get up to date on the philosophy. And the book I found very helpful is this book by Robert Kane. Kane is probably the leading libertarian philosopher at the moment, but he's very fair to compatibilism as well. And so this is really written for philosophy undergraduates. A contemporary introduction to it, well, it emphasizes the current debate, and I would recommend this book if you want to get deeply involved in the philosophy. Now, immediately one discovers that depending on the philosophy, philosophers choose different definitions. And here are two definitions I found in dictionaries. So this was a compatibilist definition in the Free Dictionary: the power of making free choices unconstrained by external agencies. Note the external. But note this one, an incompatibilist definition: the choices which are said to have no necessary determination from the nervous system or from any other physical cause. This is from a handbook of psychological terms. Of course, they don't say this is a compatibilist definition, this is an incompatibilist definition. They say just this is the definition. But you see that building their philosophy into the definition. And this is not just because it's a trivial question of what do we mean by free will. This is because the people, the philosophers who are compatibilists or incompatibilists really think that this is the useful definition. Now, I won't have time to deal with all the philosophy because I want to say something about the science, but let's just say a few words about what what compatibilist philosophers would say to defend their position. And most people who've never read a philosophy book are incompatibilists. So if you say free will and determinism are compatible, they say, wow, how is that possible? That's before you've read any philosophy books. After you've read philosophy books, you may be on one side or the other side. So what's a compatibilist going to say? He's going to make the distinction between an external constraint. I smashed the window because my sister made me do it. She pushed me. So I wasn't free, I wasn't responsible, it was my sister who did it. Or internal determinism. I smashed the window because my brain made me do it. Well, at least it is a different kind of sentence. I mean, and the second kind of determinism is a bit funny, because if my brain didn't make me do it, then I certainly wasn't responsible. So it's a bit strange to say I wasn't responsible because my brain did make me do it. So that would be a starting point for a compatibilist philosopher, but then of course the incompatibilist philosophers will have answers to that, and this leads to a great debate that could be many hours of lectures by someone more complicated, more competent than me. I'm not claiming to have proved the case for compatibilism. And let's also look at our use of words. In normal words, I say I chose coffee because I prefer it to tea. No, the because. It's a causality. So freedom doesn't imply lack of causality. And if I choose coffee because I don't know why I chose coffee, and my hand went out and I took the coffee, then you could say that wasn't free. But if I choose it because I want coffee, then then causality is necessary for freedom. And Hume had comments on this. He said, where actions do not proceed from cause in the character and disposition of the person who performed to them, they cannot redound to his honour if good, nor infamy if evil. So this strong compatibilist position has its origin in the 18th century with Hume and also Spinoza and other philosophers at that time. Now, the compatibilists would say that libertarianism is based on linguistic confusion. Freedom is the opposite of constraint, in other words, external constraint, not of determinism. Now, around 1950, almost all philosophers agreed with what I've just said. And then various philosophers in the 1970s and early 1980s came up with counter-arguments, and one of these philosophers was Peter van Inwagen, who wrote in a book what's called the consequence argument for incompatibilism. He said, if determinism is true, then our acts are the consequences of the laws of nature and events in the remote past. But it is not up to us what went on before we were born, and neither is it up to us what the laws of nature are. Therefore, the consequences of these things, including our present acts, are not up to us. Now you may say, well, that's a pretty obvious argument. That's what I would have said, even in 1920. So, except I'm not that old, but so how come that Peter van Inwagen had such an influence? But of course, he didn't just say that. He wrote a whole book on the subject. But this is the essence of the argument that the incompatibilists have used to create the new debate. And so because of this kind of argument, the debate is on, and philosophers can still justify a salary. Now, if you're going to say that, if you're a libertarian, and you've got to say that there's indeterminism in the brain, how are you going to find this indeterminism? And the most popular way, certainly all the leading incompatibilist philosophers, either they say nothing whatever about the brain, or they bring up Heisenbergian uncertainty. And I've called this quantum libertarianism. They, as you probably know, Heisenbergian uncertainty is a principle that comes straight from the wave equations of quantum physics, the Schrödinger equation. And it has two forms. The most popular is this, that the uncertainty in the momentum of, for example, an electron times the uncertainty in its position is greater than or equal to h divided by 4 pi. And h is a very small number. It's not just a number, it's got dimensions. 6 times 10 to the minus 34 joules seconds. So it's important that it is very small. And then another version is that delta t is greater than e or equal to h over 4 pi. And that's the one I'm going to use because it's going to be convenient for my purposes. And so there's great discussion among quantum physicists about whether this is really something fundamental, or whether it's really an ontological condition or not. But most think it is. They think it's not just a problem of measurement, but it is actually a fundamental uncertainty. The universe is like that. There is a fluffiness in the universe. It's not perfectly precise and determined. So the common position among philosophers is to say, well, we all know since, I suppose it's the late 1920s, that the universe is not totally determined, so determinism is no longer a problem. But I think it is still a problem in a sense, because h is very, very small. Now, how do the libertarians bring in indeterminism into their view? I mean, they usually have rather vague views of the brain. They may not mention the brain at all. But the sort of position, which I'm slightly simplifying, is that they more or less imagine that there's a decision module in the brain, which is going to compare the various decision possibilities, tea or coffee, and so on, with criteria. But actually, these philosophers are not that concerned with tea or coffee. They're more concerned with morally important decisions. Shall I kill my mother-in-law, which is what I would really love to do, or shall I respect some principles that I have about not killing my mother-in-law? So you've got decision possibilities, and you compare them with criteria, and on the basis of that you come to decisions and actions. And what one could call the standard libertarian position is to say that somewhere in the decision module there must be some kind of randomness, because the libertarians insist there's got to be randomness somewhere, and so they put it in the decision module. But there are problems with that, because I mean, if there's randomness in the decision module, you could say that's going to make for, not for responsibility, but for irresponsibility. It wasn't my fault, it was just things rattling around in my brain which didn't work properly. So then they come up with another possibility, and especially Robert Kane said that it's not all decisions that are affected by randomness, maybe Heisenbergian uncertainty. It's just special self-forming decisions or actions, which are the ones where it's a 50-50 thing. Shall I kill my mother-in-law, or shall I be nice to her? And I really can't decide, because my desire to kill her is so great, but on the other hand, I'm a moral person and I don't want to. So what shall I do? And it's a thing where you've got to give a lot of effort, a lot of thought, and you don't know what you're going to decide. And in that case, if you tossed a coin, I mean, that's not going to be messing up the brain, because in any case, you don't know what you're going to decide. So Robert Kane thinks it's just decisions, these special self-forming decisions that are important. And these will feed back on the parts of the brain which embody a character. And they will affect subsequent decisions. And then another kind of model is two-stage models. The idea that maybe, I mean, to answer Van Inwagen's consequence argument, you don't actually have to say that the indeterminism is in the decision module. It could be somewhere else, maybe in the module for creating possibilities. So you think there's maybe a stochastic mechanism in the brain for generating the possible decision, but then the actual choice will be made on a deterministic, purely rational basis. I mean, most libertarians don't support that, but some do. And then there's another completely different view, which is really, I think, the view of most people who've never read a book on philosophy. And this is neo-Cartesianism. You all know what Descartes thought about how the soul, or he didn't call it the soul, the mind, or the res cogitans, was going to interact with the brain. And people like Eccles, the Nobel Prize-winning neurobiologist, and Beck, his collaborator, a physicist, argue that the soul or the self will be influencing the decision module in the brain. So this is a sort of non-physical thing that can interact with the brain. And that is not popular among most philosophers, and certainly not among neuroscientists, but it's got a very long history. So let's look at this last position a bit more. Here's Eccles, who favoured this. And so his idea that a soul or a self or a noumenal mind, if you're a Kantian, is somehow interacting with the brain machine to lead to thoughts and actions. And this requires physical indeterminism in the brain machine. And as I say, it's not very popular. Neurobiologists don't like it because there's no evidence for it at all. And then libertarian philosophers don't like it because it's not truly indeterministic. It's taken out, instead of, I mean, the soul which is interacting with the brain, it could still be a deterministic soul, even though it's a non-physical thing. So they think this doesn't really solve the problem that they're worrying about. And then many theologians don't like it because there's a lack of biblical support for Neoplatonism. I mean, this is Cartesianism was a form of Neoplatonism. And theologians are divided between monists and dualists, but even those who support dualism are on the whole not Neoplatonists. So for all these reasons, among intellectuals, this is not a very popular position, despite the very high status of Sir John Eccles. So in the rest of this talk, I shall get down a bit more to the science, and I shall first deal with the question, is brain function determined by genes and environment? And I shall argue no, there's another factor not determined by genes and environment, which I shall call noise. And then I shall argue that even though the noise is considerable, the brain is resistant to it, which is, I think, very important. The brain works okay, despite the fact that there are things going on in it which are not totally determined by the genes and environment. And then I shall argue that Heisenbergian uncertainty is much, much smaller than this noise. This noise is physically determined. It's not determined by genes and environment, but it is determined by the laws of physics. And Heisenbergian uncertainty, this slight fuzziness in the physics, is so much smaller than the noise that it's going to be negligible. And I shall argue, therefore, that free will and responsibility are more plausibly defended by a compatibilistic approach. And of course, you may strongly disagree, and I shall be interested in your comments. Now, does the combination of genes plus environment totally determine the brain? One day at table, when our daughters were much younger and less ladylike than they are now, our younger daughter was behaving badly, and we scolded her. And she said, well, there were basically two possibilities. Either it's genetic, in which case it comes from you, or I've been badly brought up, in which case it's your fault. Or she might have said it's a combination of the two. So the question is, does genes plus environment make me? And I think this is inherently unlikely, at least unlikely to be completely true, because in the human brain with more than 10 to the 15 synapses, it would be hard for the 30,000 genes to specify every tiny detail. And there's support for this because you can bring up like Daphnia and grasshoppers and locusts, you can make them genetically identical, isogenetic, and then you can try to have them in an identical environment, and you can see what happens. You can't really do this experiment with humans. For example, my twin brother is bigger and better than me because he stole some of my blood before birth. This is an environmental effect before birth. He got more blood, I got less blood. And so that's one of the reasons why we're a bit different. And it's very hard to control this in mammals. But with insects and so on, it's easier to control. And in all these cases, I won't go into the detail, if you do electron microscopy in the brain, you find subtle differences in brain connectivity, in the positions of neurons, in the branching patterns of the dendrites of neurons, and so on. So this looks as though there's something that's not entirely controlled by genes plus environment. But this is contestable because, here's just one more case, which is it's a nice one. There's this fish, which you can have isogenic Amazon mollies, and you find that in 50% of them, the left optic nerve goes over the right optic nerve, the nerve going from the retina to the brain, and in 50% it's the opposite. And this seems to be not genetic at all, it's just random. And this is presumably because the very first axons which grow from the retina to the brain, which come to this region called the chiasm, they may go over or under, and then the other ones coming afterwards follow their leader, so to speak. And so it all depends on an arbitrary decision at the optic chiasm here. So this is not determined by genes and environment. Now, what could cause these differences? A book came out about 10 years ago by Finch and Kirkwood, arguing really for what I'm saying at this moment, that there's a role for chance in development, and they were interested in aging, and they showed that these early chance events in development could also affect aging. And they call these chance events intrinsic chance, and that's what I've been calling noise. But there's the objection that could there be uncontrolled environmental differences, even if you've got Daphnia or grasshoppers and you've managed to control the environment as well as possible. Maybe you haven't completely succeeded in eliminating chance events. Maybe even before the laying of the eggs, there could be chance events that would affect this. And so the question is, so we've got genes and environments and intrinsic chance, but we don't know too much about this intrinsic chance. We don't know how important it is, how much the differences are due to subtle environmental differences we haven't managed to control. And for that reason, we need to look more at the cellular events. And so I'm going to get even more complicated now. Now, in any cell, there is a great role for thermal noise. You know, thermal noise in any liquid, the molecules are bouncing around more or less randomly. And the greater the temperature, the more movement there is. And that's what heat energy is, in fact. And so if this is the membrane of a cell, and you've got some molecules outside the cell, maybe these are ions that some of which will go in through these ion channels, and they're just bouncing about in random directions, but they may get into this channel, and then, because they're a bit guided here, they'll go into the cell. But on the whole, their movement is random, and some will come in and others won't. But because there may be 100 million of these ions, then on a random basis, some will go in the right direction, and we can calculate how many will go in and so on. We can't know which ions will go in and which won't, but that doesn't matter. We can find out, we can calculate the number that will go in. And then if you look at another molecule, this could be water, for example, just the different parts, this could be oxygen and hydrogen, they're stuck together by bonds, and there is movement even within the molecule. And these movements are all due to heat. They're not controlled by genes or environment, they're just random movement controlled due to heat. And as I mentioned, the relative influence of this thermal noise will be reduced if there's a very large number, like 100 million molecules, then we can calculate. But supposing there are only about 20 molecules, then the fact that they're just moving randomly, it introduces real randomness that matters. And though this is meant to be a cell, this is meant to be the nucleus of a cell, this is meant to be a ribosome, a place where proteins are made outside the nucleus, and this is meant to be a gene, in other words, some DNA, which contains a coding region, where there's a sequence that's going to make the RNA that's going to go and make the protein finally. And then this is another part of the gene, which is going to be used for controlling how fast the transcription, in other words, the making of the RNA goes on. And when a sequence of RNA is produced here, this will be a well-controlled event because it follows a sequence of nucleotides in the gene. But then, once it's made, it's going to move about randomly. And just on a random basis, some of these will, or most of them will finally find a pore which will enable them to get out. And then by the continuing random movements, they'll finally get to a ribosome. And if there are hundreds or thousands of these, then well, let's say if there are thousands of these, then some will get there, some won't, and you can calculate how many. But if there are only about 20, as is often the case, then the randomness will really matter. And then some of these, let's suppose that on this ribosome there will also be proteins made called transcription factors that have a role to diffuse back to the binding site here, where they're going to control how fast the transcription goes on. These also have to diffuse randomly. And just as if you put hot water and cold water in two sides of a bath, they'll mix together soon, and you can predict the result, but you can't predict what will happen to the individual molecules. That's okay because there are millions and millions of molecules. When there are just a few, this random diffusion may or may not get the transcription factor to the correct site. Now, there has been a lot of research on this in the last 10 years. I have to say that the research has been mainly on bacteria and other very simple organisms, not on human brains and so on. But nevertheless, by this work on bacteria, it has been shown that what I'm talking about now really does matter. It does introduce a considerable randomness to the production of proteins from the genes. Now, another situation where randomness plays a role is what's called ion channel noise. Ion channels are channels in the membrane of the cell. They're made of several protein subunits. And if it's ions, it might be sodium ions or calcium ions or so on. They may diffuse in or out. And how fast they diffuse in or out, it already has a random element, as I've argued. But there's another factor that can also contribute. It's because the subunit proteins of this ion channel, they're moving about within the subunit protein and between themselves. So the ion channel will sometimes be just opening or closing, but just because of these random movements called stable conformation changes. Sorry, switching between alternative stable conformations. In other words, the proteins can be stuck together in one way or another way, and they're switching between the possible conformations randomly, and this will open and close the channels. And this will cause some degree of randomness, and this also has been quite well studied. When I say randomness, I mean, it's all determined by the laws of physics. I'm not denying that it's determined by the laws of physics, but it's not determined by genes plus environment. Now, and then we can say, well, will this ion channel noise really matter? Because after all, if you've got a cell with hundreds or thousands of ion channels, and you've got ion, say calcium ions going in or something like that, then you can say it's all going to average out in the cell, if you think of the cell like a big balloon. And if there's some randomness in one of the ion channels, or in fact in all of the ion channels, nevertheless, if you take them all together, it's all going to even out. And that's not true, because many events in the cell depend on the concentration of ions, such as calcium ions, in a very tiny part of the cell. And one of these cases is the communication between one neuron and the next neuron. So this is meant to be a neuron, this is its axon. It sends a burst of electricity called the action potential down the axon. And then this will cause vesicles here to fuse with the membrane and release their content of neurotransmitter. We've got this part in higher magnification here, so we've got the vesicles, and some of them are docked. They're linked to the membrane by proteins. They're just held to the membrane. And one of these, the orange one, called synaptotagmin, changes its shape when calcium binds to it. And so if calcium comes into the presynaptic neuron here by a calcium channel, then it binds to the synaptotagmin. And then this will change its shape, and it will literally pull the vesicle against the membrane and cause the membrane to fuse and let the red things, the neurotransmitter molecules, to come out. And these will fuse to the synaptic cleft, bind to receptor proteins here, and when they bind to a receptor protein, this will open a hole, called a pore, in the postsynaptic membrane, and this will allow sodium or other ions to flow in or out of the cell. So the important point I'm making here is that what matters for this fusion event is not calcium spread throughout the whole cell. It's the calcium just at this very tiny region, and fluctuations in this really will matter. And this, again, has been studied quite well in the last few years. Of course, I can't go into tremendous detail on this, but I think it's generally accepted that this local concentration of calcium is an important thing, and fluctuations in it do matter. And the same thing has been studied with, for example, sodium. For example, one reason we don't get neurons smaller than 3 microns in diameter is that the smaller the neuron is, the more these fluctuations matter. And for very small neurons, less than 3 microns, they would just go haywire because of random events due to the sodium flowing in due to random events. So that all these events do matter. But now the next point I want to make, having said that these matter in a sense, they will actually affect the activity of the nervous system. They won't just all average out. Nevertheless, even though they affect the activity of the nervous system, we can still think, our brains still work, our brains are resistant to some degree of noise. So, and now this has got to be somewhat simplified, but one thing is, I want to first talk about biochemical circuits. Circuits within a single cell, it could be a neuron or another cell. And one thing is mass action. Just when you've got a lot of a single kind of molecule, then the randomness will even out. So in some cases this will be true. Another thing is that there can be redundant biochemical pathways. For example, there's a gene called C-gene N-terminal kinase, but they call it JNK, J-N-K. And there are 3 different JNK genes, and each of these genes produces several different versions of protein. But let's just take the genes, and then let's just consider JNK 1 and 2, which are the most widespread with the JNK molecules. If you make a knockout mouse lacking JNK 1 and 2, the mouse will not be viable. Before birth, it will die. You know, you can make so-called knockout mice, which lack a gene. Clever biochemists can make these mice. And but if you make the knockout mouse lacking JNK 1 or JNK 2, but not both, they won't be totally normal, but they will be more or less viable. And you have to do a pretty detailed study to see what's wrong with these mice, because these 2 different genes, which are similar but not identical, they can compensate for each other. So it's a bit like an office where one of the secretaries is ill, and the other one's not quite as competent for some of the tasks, but nevertheless, when one of them's ill, the other one can do the job. And so just as a company is resistant to minor fluctuations like the secretary being ill, so our brain is resistant to what I would consider quite a large change, like a whole important gene missing. Now, and then there's negative feedback, and probably I don't need to say much. You all know about negative feedback. If you've got a thermostat, if you want to adjust the temperature of the room, you measure the temperature. That feeds back to a comparator. You compare the measured temperature with the chosen temperature, and if the measured temperature is lower, you switch on the heater. And that works, but the response of the system must be faster than the noise, and the noise must not be in the feedback path, but with a few limitations. Apart from a few limitations, negative feedback can be a thing that will make the nervous system or the cell resistant to noise. Now, at the level of neural circuits, there are also various events, for example, threshold events. When an action potential occurs, I mean, we're measuring here the electrical potential difference between the inside and the outside of a cell, and it's normally around minus 70 millivolts. Actually, this is a mistake. It shouldn't be minus 70. It's normally around minus 70, and there's a trigger potential which is, I think, around minus 55, where if the potential gets to the trigger level, then an action potential will be produced. So my point here is that the minor fluctuations won't matter if they're not close to the threshold or trigger potential. But if they're close to the threshold, then they will matter. But since often so is not close to the threshold, minor noise, minor fluctuations won't matter. And then there's averaging. I mean, the nervous system is all the time doing intelligent things to make the best guesses. We get incomplete information, and the nervous system is guessing. And if we're in very weak light, and we're looking at an object, so the P are meant to be photoreceptors. They could be rods, which are the more sensitive photoreceptors in the retina. And they all feed onto the same next cell, which is called a bipolar cell. And we imagine there's light shining on all these receptors. And unless there is strong reason to think otherwise, the nervous system will assume that the light level falling onto adjacent photoreceptors is roughly the same. And so it will measure the light on the basis of an averaging process, just assuming that it's uniform. And that way it can exploit the assumed redundancy in the information. In other words, it's redundant because it's similar light levels in a limited region of the retina. So the nervous system does a lot of this, and this helps to make it resistant to noise. And then, in more subtle ways, the nervous system also makes prior expectations and uses those prior expectations to... Sorry, I think some of you find it hard to see because I stand just in front of the screen, sorry. So if, for example, this could be the blind spot. You know, there's a blind spot where the optic nerve comes into the retina, where we don't have photoreceptors, where we are blind in one eye. Or it could be that we have a lesion, maybe in the brain, which means we're blind in a certain part of the visual field, but if it's a small part, then, and supposing this is the image of a line, going through, and its image on the retina goes through the blind region, then we will just see a continuous line. Because, and the technical word is Bayesian inference, so the nervous system makes the best guess, and if you've got what looks like a continuous line, then the nervous system assumes that we've just got a continuous line, and we see just a continuous line. So these are just a few examples of all the tricks the nervous system uses, which helps to make us resistant to minor fluctuations, such as the fluctuations due to thermal noise that I mentioned. So now let's look at Heisenbergian uncertainty. And the problem is that, at least the problem for a libertarian, is that this uncertainty is much, much smaller than the noise I've mentioned. And so if we got a brain that's not troubled by these billiard balls, in other words, water molecules and so on, that are bouncing about in our cells, and all these sources of indeterminate, or at least noise that I talked about, if the nervous system is not worried by that, then it's certainly not going to be worried by Heisenbergian uncertainty. It's certainly not going to be affected significantly by Heisenbergian uncertainty. So let's just take one example. Where might Heisenbergian effects occur? The fluffiness of the electrons and so on. Where could that play a role? Well, Eccles and Beck thought that this could occur at this event I've described before, this fusion event of synaptic vesicles releasing their transmitter. They thought that tiny changes might play a role. Although this is not exactly what they said. I think modern supporters of this view would say that one place which could be very sensitive would be the calcium ion, where the calcium goes in. And so you might argue that, for example, a molecular bond in the calcium channel, if you change that for a very short time, maybe that could cause sufficient calcium to go in to affect the fusion with the synaptic vesicle. Now, when I say for a particular time, I'm going to take this equation delta E delta T, and for it to be biologically significant, the delta T has to be at least 10 microseconds. And so we're going to calculate what the energy change would be. And basically, if you put in the numbers, h, this very small value, delta t about 10 microseconds, we come up with delta E is about 5.2 times 10 to the minus 30 joules. Now this is about 200,000 times too small to affect the functioning of an ion channel by disrupting the very weakest of all the molecular bonds, the van der Waals interaction. So my point, I'm not going to spend too much time boring you with the calculations, but my point is that Heisenbergian uncertainty is about 200,000 times too small to do the job that libertarians would like it to do. Now, so that's a problem. Now, how are we going to solve that? Now, one suggestion people sometimes make is that you could amplify this very tiny Heisenbergian uncertainty, which is 200 times too small. You could find a way of amplifying it, maybe by chaos. Now, we're entering here into very difficult territory. It would be interesting if there were any experts on quantum chaos here, but basically, there was a debate as to whether quantum chaos exists at all. Chaos, you probably know, is extreme sensitivity to initial conditions or fluctuations. So, if, like with the weather, a tiny flap of a butterfly's wing in Mexico could cause a tornado in Shanghai and so on. This sort of view that's been very much in the newspapers for the last 20 years. This sort of amplification of tiny fluctuations, could that be the explanation? And now you've got to have two things here. You've first got to say that there is chaos in the brain, and this is another technical difficult area where I don't think it's really proved that there's chaos in the brain, but there may be. Certainly a lot of good scientists think there is chaos in the brain, so let's accept that maybe there is chaos in the brain. But the problem is that when chaos the interaction between chaos and Heisenberg and quantum physics doesn't work mathematically. You can have one or the other, but you can't have both. And maybe I can go into that more if you have questions about it. But I think even supporters of this view do recognize that there is a problem. I think I'm going to go on fairly quickly because of time, but we can deal with that in questions if you want to. But then the second point, which I think is even more clear than the point I've just made, is that it's the point I made before, that this, if you compare the energy due to thermal fluctuations, which I talked about before, that's about 6.4 times 10 to the minus 21 joules. And you compare that with the 10 to the minus 30 joules I talked about before. So we're about 10 to the 9 times, so the Heisenbergian uncertainty in energy is about 10 to the 9 times too small compared with thermal energy. So someone who wants to say that Heisenbergian uncertainty is going to give the indeterminism required for libertarian philosophy, he's got to face the fact that the brain is resistant to fluctuations that are 10 to the 9, in other words, 1,000 million times greater. So that doesn't make sense. Then the third problem is that not all physicists accept that Heisenbergian uncertainty is an absolutely fundamental limitation to knowledge. And so I therefore come up to my last point, that free will and responsibility are more plausibly defended by a compatibilistic approach. Now, most compatibilistic philosophers don't start with the science. They give philosophical reasons to think that compatibilism is the best approach. And then I add to their arguments my calculations and so on to argue that we'd better, if we want to defend free will, we're better off defending a compatibilistic approach. Now, just to avoid misunderstanding, I don't claim to have addressed the philosophical arguments of those who are opposed to compatibilism, in other words, the incompatibilists. I mean, this is a vast field. This could be several hours of lectures by a philosopher. I've mentioned some of the arguments, but I don't claim to have addressed this well. Now, as a Christian, I hear people who don't like compatibilism because they think it's atheistic. I mean, Daniel Dennett has written some very widely read books arguing for compatibilism. And of course he's a famous atheist. And compatibilism was proposed by Hume, who was more or less an atheist, and Spinoza, who was a pantheist. And they think, well, these are the enemy. This is we don't want Christians accepting this horrible compatibilism. But this is not really true. There are also many Christians who are compatibilists. The philosopher in Baker, Malcolm Jeeves, a neuropsychologist, Donald Mackay, who was my thesis supervisor, he was a philosopher, neurobiologist. A book that's come out by Nancy Murphy and Warren Brown, a philosopher and a neurobiologist. Did my neurons make me do it? All these people, these are Christians too. So I don't think the divide is between Christian libertarianism and anti-Christian or these, let's say, atheistic compatibilism. It's much more complicated. We've got Christians on both sides and we've got atheists on both sides. So these are my conclusions. The philosophical debate about determinism and free will is far from being resolved. Most philosophers are compatibilist or libertarian, although not all. Christians and other theists are found in both camps, and Heisenbergian uncertainty doesn't currently seem to be a sound basis for defending a libertarian position, and so I think that free will and responsibility are more plausibly defended by a compatibilistic approach. Well, thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, I'm sure there's plenty of questions. Please, David.
Yes, it seems to me that one of the problems of a wholly deterministic view of brain function is that it doesn't necessarily entail self-awareness. I mean, it doesn't have to be a me to make decisions. Can you argue back from that the very fact of self-awareness makes a wholly deterministic view of brain function improbable, if you agree with it.
Well, I certainly agree about the importance of self-awareness, and we all know that we're self-aware. So, and I think that, I mean, neuroscience can't at the moment answer the question of why are we aware. I mean, why we have the sort of behavior we associate with awareness. We can say, oh yes, well this is good for survival. But then you could say, well, why couldn't it be a robot who seems he's aware, and if you can't prove that I'm aware? I mean, I say I'm aware, and you are kind enough to think I am aware, but I can't prove that. So I fully agree with that. But to me, it's not entirely clear why a deterministic version is incompatible with awareness. I don't understand what the problem is there. Would you like to just...
I think it's just that it doesn't necessarily imply that the...
Oh no, I agree it doesn't imply it.
I think that's the point, really.
Well look, I fully agree that to have a full philosophy of mind, you've got to have mind. You've got to have conscious thought. But for this, I mean, so I fully agree we've got to keep that in mind. But to me, this is not a problem with determinism in itself. Although we've got to see, I mean, if the determinism goes into a materialistic philosophy along the lines of Daniel Dennett, then I think we have got problems. So I agree with that. And so there are, of course, could I come and give another lecture this afternoon? I mean, because this is a vast, wider question you're raising, and I agree it's a vast question that needs addressing.
Please, at the back, yes.
How does the future knowledge affect your explanation?
When you say future knowledge, what do you mean?
Because we can't predict future knowledge, but yet future knowledge we know affects our behaviour.
Well, so you're just talking about future knowledge in the normal sense, things I don't know now that I will discover?
Yeah, future discoveries.
Well, I mean, okay, we got, let's say we got a deterministic universe. I don't actually think the universe is completely deterministic, because what I said about Heisenberg in determinism, I was talking about its influence on the brain. Now, maybe in other situations it is important. I didn't address that. But let's say, let's imagine we do have a completely deterministic universe. Then, just as the events unfold, we will discover new things. But I don't see why this is a problem for determinism.
Are you perhaps suggesting if our future discoveries of the brain enable us to know all that we need to know about the brain? Let me pose that question to Peter. I'm a super scientist, you know, in 300 years' time. I now know everything about the brain. I know the position of every synapse, I know the inputs and the outputs, I have quantum computers that will tell me exactly, you know, where things are, what's happening exactly in your brain at every microsecond. That kind of discovery. I don't know if that's your question, but I'm just going to ask it anyway. So does that change your argument?
Now you see, Dennis is cheating because he knows that my thesis supervisor was Donald Mackay, who wrote a great deal on this question, and so I can't avoid the question. Which I would have liked to avoid because it's again a lecture in itself. But I mean, basically, it can be argued that supposing someone has a complete description of my brain, and he's going to say, I'm going to make a choice of tea or coffee and so on. His prediction predicts everything that's going to go on in my brain in the process of making the decision. If I were to be shown the description, that will affect the decision-making module of my brain. So that will invalidate the prediction. Now you could say, well, okay, well then he doesn't need to show it to me. But the point is that it is a prediction of my brain activity that does not have unconditional claim on my assent. Now, if you haven't understood that, it's okay, because when Mackay gave a 45-minute lecture on the subject, people still didn't understand. But I mean, I think I have to be fairly brief on that point. And this is linked up to Gödel's theorem. You probably know that a mathematical system, you can't prove the completeness and the validity of a mathematical system within the system. So there are vast questions here. I agree.
Okay. Please, yes.
I'm a little nervous about general quantum arguments because a quantum system probably has to be looked at each one in its own right. You could have quantum systems that are unstable, so they have a lifetime. Now, you can't necessarily decrease that lifetime by joggling the system around. It might still have a long lifetime. You'd have to look at each one. So you might want to be a little bit more cautious about the overall generality of the Heisenberg argument.
Okay, so you're saying the Heisenberg uncertainty principle may not apply in all cases?
Well, let's take an argument, a situation that won't apply here. If you have an unstable radioactive atom, it has a lifetime, let's say, of 1 second. Now, you won't speed up that lifetime to less than a microsecond by putting in thermal noise. So that would be an extreme case of a long lifetime which still remains as a quantum lifetime, even though you've got a lot of noise there. So you actually do have to consider what is the system that I'm looking at, and then you may well find your argument applies, but there are some possible subtleties here.
Okay, well, that's a very valuable comment, and I think I would need to talk to you afterwards to fully understand, but thank you.
Please, yes, yes. Second row, thank you, yes. Yeah.
Well, I was wondering whether there are any other sources of noise in the brain, because we do know that the brain generates a lot of noise, since we have 10 to the 12 neurons in the brain, and they are organized in a small world, sort of a network. Everything that is beyond the small world network is practically generated by axons which are very far away and are practically noise for the local axons which are in the area. So is that not another sort of source of noise which is more on the order of magnitude?
Well, yes,
rather than
I do agree with that, yes. I was under time pressure. But let's say you've got axons coming from different parts of the brain that are converging on a neuron. Then whether the next neuron fires will depend very precisely on the exact timing of its different inputs coming from different places. And there are many questions like that that are all to do with coincidences of one kind or another, that I just didn't consider them because of the time. But I agree with you. Now, okay, so I agree. I mean, it's a vast subject, but I do agree.
Third row, please, thank you. Yes.
I'm interested in the tension between, say, Mackay and Dennett with regards to faith. Because if the compatibilist argument is that, say, free will is compatible with brain activity, could you not say that one's faith is compatible with brain activity? Now, that sounds like you're being led down a line that's what faith is, that's all faith is, a reductive position. So it's you're open to the criticism then of explaining faith away, say. So I'm not concerned with the religious questions about what's out there, just it's still about, it's an ad hominem question about faith, really.
Okay, now I actually, well, I agree. I actually think that Mackay and Dennett are pretty close on many things. In fact, Dennett sometimes does refer to Mackay and so on for support. And I think that what Dennett does quite well is argue that an atheistic position can be tenable. And if that's all he's trying to say, then I would agree on many things that he said. But I mean, but he's more than that. I mean, he's a crusading atheist, and he wants to crusade for atheism. And I don't think he demonstrates atheism, of course. I mean, he doesn't. I don't think he really attempts to even. But what he tries to show is that with his atheist position, he can have a view which has the free will worth, the kinds of free will worth wanting, to quote his good expression.
Maybe I could just mention, say, two problems with that. but one might be questions to do with how God has created a universe where that would occur, that's what faith is. And secondly, generally, phenomenologically, that's not how we experience faith, whereas if faith would be about something, it would have representational content that we would argue about and think about, rather than just a neurochemical activity.
Okay, look, I think I agree.
It's a huge question.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a huge question. I'd like to take just the second part.
Two huge questions.
What faith is about. And to me, faith is about my believing in Jesus Christ, who was God made man, God expressed in human form on this earth, and I believe in him, and I even believe he died for my sins and so on. So I have a great many beliefs there that then it doesn't address. So I mean, this is another level of description. And if one's trying to put together the movement of electrons or water molecules and so on in the brain with my understanding of Jesus dying on the cross, they're so far apart that I can't put them together.
But both could be redescribed in terms of brain activity, or compatibilists would argue.
Well, yes, but I mean, to me that's not a problem. I mean, if someone thinks it's a problem, it's for him to show it. I mean, I believe that 2 + 2 is 4. And my reason, if you ask, well, why does this person believe that 2 + 2 is 4? You could look in the brain. Oh, it's all explained by brain activity. But that doesn't invalidate my belief that 2 + 2 is 4, or of course much more complicated beliefs as well. So the understanding something at the level of brain activity doesn't show the belief to be false. Of course, it doesn't show the belief to be true either. So I think I'm agreeing with you. Is that right, Anne?
I think we could go on and maybe someone else wants to.
I think, yeah, we're just about out of time. Probably, I was going to say, does anyone have a quick question? I know it's not going to be a quick question. Nothing in this field is a quick question. I think we'll have to stop because I know many people have to leave at 2 o'clock. So, could we possibly? Can you come up and chat? I think Peter can hang around a little bit afterwards, and we do promise people to finish at 2 really, because we know people have to run away to labs and all kinds of stuff. So, so I think we'll have to stop that fascinating discussion here, regretful as that is, and thank Peter very much for stretching our brains this morning.